0.6%, and the IBEX in the red, the FTSE MIB edging into the green. I talked about the jump in US equities yesterday, biggest jump in 2 weeks, but futures a little bit softer today. S&P 500 E-minis down 0.2%, NASDAQ futures lower by 0.3%, Dow futures lower by 0.2%. There's a great piece on the Bloomberg talking about how Wall Street is finding it really hard to make out how to actually trade these impeachment risks. You've got all kinds of diverging views out there. I mean, on 10-year Treasury yields, the impact yesterday was for a jump of 9 basis points. But again, the trade headlines and President Trump's words on that could have fed into that. The 10-year yield moves down 4 basis points today. We dip below 170. The 10-year Bund yield goes nowhere, negative 58. We'll talk about Sabine Lachtenschläger's resignation this hour as well. But for now, European bond markets quiet. The 10-year gilt yield goes nowhere as well. The dollar certainly got a lift yesterday too. Does all the impeachment risk actually just make the dollar even more attractive just because of the safe haven? It jumped the most since March. We steady up today. Elsewhere, looking at G10, the New Zealand dollar outperforming up 0.4%. And then taking a quick check on crude oil, that is really going nowhere today. So we're absolutely flat on WTI, 56.47, and Brent at 62.43.
Okay, let's have a look at what stocks there are to watch this morning. Bloomberg's Joe Easton has joined us here in our London studio. So, Joe, good morning. Now, IAG, bit of a warning out there about a decline in earnings.
Yes, good morning. So, IAG, the British Airways owner, is counting the cost of recent strikes that led to the cancellation of around 2,000 flights earlier this month, and have also noted some declining trends in their lower cost units. So, the combined impact, they say, will be a reduction in adjusted operating profit of around 215 million euros. So, although the company had adjusted operating profit last year of around 3.5 billion euros, it's still a significant chunk. And quite worryingly, they do warn that there's still been no further progress on talks with the main pilot union. And they say that clearly, if there are industrial action, further industrial action, it will cut profit further. So it's a warning from IAG, the British Airways owner, and those shares are down around 2.4% this morning.
Moving on to tobacco now. Imperial Tobacco, the tobacco company based here in the UK, Imperial Brands, they've lowered their earnings guidance. Now, many companies have been trying to get into the vaping area, but there's been some pushback on that in America, so I guess that's probably what's the effect.
That's right. So, as you mentioned, it's really due to this regulatory clampdown on vaping. So there's been a big pushback against flavoured vaping, for example, in the US, and Imperial are already saying that this is starting to hurt their earnings. And they do say that they note this rising backlash against the e-cigarette market, and they say that sales rose about 2% in the 12 months through to September, but in May they said that they would rise more than 4%. So sales have slowed down. They're saying it's due to vaping, and interestingly, it does come after Altria and Philip Morris cancelled plans. Two US rivals cancelled plans to re-merge. That news came last night. And we're just seeing Imperial Brand shares opening down around 7%, and also British American Tobacco getting a read across down 3%.
So a bit of a trend there, I think. Now, Pearson, the education publisher, they saw their profit at the bottom end of the guidance. That's somewhat surprising, but apparently based on US weakness.
Yes, so they're saying that there's a weakness in university demand in the US for their textbooks and their online education materials. And this is obviously the company that has refocused on education over the last year or two. They previously owned the Financial Times, sold that around 3 years ago, focused on this education division, and it is showing signs of suffering. They've actually issued a few profit warnings over the last couple of years. This is the latest one, and it's sending the shares down around 11% this morning. So it's a big miss for Pearson. As I mentioned, those shares dropping as much as 11%.
Joe, thanks very much indeed for that. Joe Easton there joining us here in our London studio.
And let's turn to our top stories now. In the UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson came out fighting in his first appearance back in Parliament. He refused to resign or even apologise in heated exchanges in Parliament. He also challenged his opponents to trigger an election, accusing them of cowardice for not doing so. Johnson says he'll look at another suspension in order to set out his domestic agenda.
I think the House and the country does need a Queen's speech, and we will be examining the judgment to see exactly how that should be brought forward.
Today, it's expected the government will ask the Commons for a short adjournment to allow the Conservative Party conference to take place.
And in the US, Democratic leadership and the President are commenting on the call summary between the Presidents of the US and Ukraine. Bloomberg's Ed Baxter has the story.
The chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, says it shows definite abuse on the part of President Donald Trump.
Having already sought foreign help in his first presidential campaign, would now abuse the power of his office yet again, this time to seek the help of another nation in his presidential campaign, is the most fundamental betrayal of his oath of office.
But President Trump says it is just another witch hunt.
The witch hunt continues, but they're getting hit hard on this witch hunt because when they look at the information, it's a joke. Impeachment for that?
Democrats say yes, so far. In San Francisco, I'm Ed Baxter, Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.
The impeachment fight now moves to the House of Representatives. The acting director of national intelligence is going to appear before a committee at 12 p.m. London time today to discuss the complaint filed by an unidentified whistleblower.
And we've been talking about the market reaction to all this and the dollar strength we saw yesterday, perhaps meaning that investors are flocking to the safe haven of the dollar with political risk. But one thing that seems to have gone a tiny bit under the radar, Roger, is that we had Charles Evans, the Chicago Fed chief, who's often a dove, talking about that there potentially isn't need for another rate cut, saying policy is currently well positioned. So that also could maybe explain sort of some of the dollar strength that we saw yesterday, as well as the weakness in gold, although gold bouncing back today.
And we also, of course, had Kaplan from the Dallas Fed saying that perhaps the actions of the central bank in this sort of area monetary policy was a limit to what it would actually achieve. Okay, turning to trade news this morning, Donald Trump signed a limited pact with the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe that eases access for $7.2 billion in US farm goods. Speaking to the reporters in New York, Abe said the trade deal contributes to the global economy.
The U.S. and Japan are not only longtime allies, but also the world's biggest and third biggest economies. The trade deal between the two countries is quite significant, as it not only contributes to our countries, but also to the global economy.
Shinzo Abe also said the US president promised he wouldn't impose fresh tariffs on Japanese auto exports.
Meanwhile, Donald Trump said a trade deal with China is getting closer and closer, and there's a good chance it will get done. That was before the US said it will sanction some Chinese firms for helping Iran sell oil.
And staying with trade news, the European Union's weighing an aggressive response to potential US tariffs over Airbus subsidies, threatening further deterioration in transatlantic relations. According to people familiar, the World Trade Organization will authorize US duties on nearly $8 billion of EU goods. The tariffs could hit next month, targeting planes and parts, as well as luxury products such as wine and spirits and leather goods. The confidential WTO decision isn't due to be published until September the 30th.
European Central Bank board member Sabine Lautenschläger has unexpectedly resigned. It's more than 2 years before her term was due to end. The ECB gave no reason for her departure, but Lautenschläger was one of the strongest opponents to resuming bond purchases and cutting rates. She'll step down on October the 31st. That's also Mario Draghi's last day in office.
Let's get the latest now in global news. Here's Bloomberg's Leanne Gerrans. Leanne, good morning.
Good morning, Roger. Benjamin Netanyahu has been tasked with forming a new government in Israel despite no clear sign he can end the political stalemate. Israel's president made the announcement last night.
The ability of member of the Knesset, Benjamin Netanyahu, to form a government is better right now. Therefore, sir, I've decided to grant you the possibility to form a government.
This month's election left Netanyahu neck and neck with former military chief Benny Gantz. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has dampened hopes that the third largest emitter of carbon dioxide will move quickly to reduce the use of coal, in part blaming the country's exclusion from a global uranium suppliers group. Speaking to Michael Bloomberg at the Global Business Forum, Modi reiterated the importance of coal to ensure power for the masses.
We cannot ignore it, but there is a solution to it. We want to use gasified coal. So the assets that India has, we cannot deny them. At the same time, we want to see how we can use these assets in an environment-friendly way. That is what we're focusing on.
The Saudi Crown Prince says the murder of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi happened on his watch, but without his knowledge. Frontline PSB said Mohammed bin Salman made the comments in a documentary in 2018, just 2 months after the killing in the kingdom's consulate in Istanbul. Last year, a UN report said there was credible evidence the Crown Prince was indeed liable for Khashoggi's murder. And millions of people in 170 countries took to the streets demanding action on climate change. change as pressure mounts. Titans of business and political pledged to fight global warming, but offered very few concrete plans. At the UN summit and the Bloomberg Global Business Forum, they acknowledged that more must be done. New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says the matter is urgent.
Time is running out for us to address climate change, so I think it's right that they hold our feet to the fire.
Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg. Roger.
Leanne, thank you. Now, here's a look at what you should be watching out for today. It's a bumper day for central bank speakers. ECB President Mario Draghi kicks things off at 2:30 p.m. UK time. He'll be addressing the European Systemic Risk Board conference, which opens today in Frankfurt. Also over in the US, we'll hear from Dallas Fed President Robert Kaplan, St. Louis Fed President James Bullard, Vice Chairman Richard Clarida, and San Francisco Fed President Mary Daly. Speeches will be closely listened to for clues on the Fed's policy ahead of its coming rate decision next month. Also, of course, the UN General Assembly enters its third day. This is Bloomberg.
All money managers might seem the same, but while some give their clients cookie-cutter portfolios, Fisher Investments tailors portfolios to your goals and needs. Some only call when they have something to sell. Fisher calls regularly, so you stay informed. And while some advisors are happy to earn commissions whether you do well or not, Fisher Investments fees are structured so we do better when you do better. In other words, we're on your side. Maybe that's why most of our clients come from other money managers. So if you're in or nearing retirement, talk with us and find out why investors are switching to and staying with Fisher Investments. Fisher Investments. Clearly better money management. Investments in securities involve the risk of loss. Visit us at FisherInvestments.com to find out what we can do for you.
Interactive Brokers' premium technology and automation provides clients with lowest cost access to global markets. Access stocks, options, futures, Forex, fixed income, and ETFs on over 125 markets in 31 countries and 24 currencies. Fund your account in multiple currencies and trade assets denominated in multiple currencies from a single account. Learn how Interactive Brokers minimizes your costs to maximize your returns at ibkr.com/YIB.
Melissa from Michigan. I work an extra part-time job serving lunch at my child's school, but I still can't afford to put food on our table.
Daniel from California. Choosing whether to pay the rent or pay to fix the car to get to work doesn't leave us with much at all. Now we can't even pay for meals.
Hunger is a story we can end. End it at feedingamerica.org. Brought to you by Feeding America and the Ad Council.
Influential conversations from Bloomberg Television. Here's Taylor Riggs.
Dropbox is going way beyond file sharing. The San Francisco-based company announced new services Wednesday, including a new desktop app, which functions as a digital hub where workers can collaborate with colleagues on projects that require access to digital files. With more on the announcement of Dropbox Spaces, it's Dropbox CEO Drew Houston. So, Drew, talk to me about Dropbox Spaces. What does this do?
So we announced Dropbox Spaces, which is one of the biggest changes we've ever made to Dropbox. And it's our first step towards building what we call the smart workspace, which is a calmer and more focused working environment, and changes the Dropbox experience from being a folder full of files to an intelligent collaborative team workspace for all your cloud content. Because we watch as our customers are using Office, they're using G Suite and Slack and Zoom. Dropbox is becoming this new kind of app that brings all these other apps together.
There's been a lot of scrutiny recently on unprofitable companies. You've been public for about 18 months or so. What's been the biggest challenge?
I mean, it's been pretty straightforward for us. And in many ways, we laid the tracks for being a public company years before we ever filed for an IPO. The biggest challenge is actually something that I think is healthy for us, which is it's like being drafted in the majors. There's a big scoreboard.
Hear more interviews like this one on Bloomberg Television, streaming live on Bloomberg.com and on the Bloomberg mobile app, or check your local cable listings.
Markets, headlines and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app and at TikTok on Twitter. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg's European headquarters in London, I'm Roger Hearing. Time for a Bloomberg Radio Business Flash. Now over to First Word Breaking News Desk for today's morning call. Here's Michael Reid. Michael.
Good morning, Roger. European equities trade either side of unchanged. Oil and gas, tech and utility names trade well. Banks and media names lagging. Nasdaq futures slipped overnight after Facebook said to become a target of a second federal antitrust probe. S&P futures followed a touch lower but trade off worse levels. Treasuries continue the overnight richening move. The belly of the curve underperforming. We've had a choppy start for Euro govies. German curve bull steeper. The peripheral spreads are slightly tighter to core. G10 FX is mostly sideways. We've seen a small push towards the dollar in recent trade. Cable offered to trade around yesterday's lows. The New Zealand dollar, the notable outperformer versus G10 peers, jumping after the RBNZ governor said that unconventional policy was unlikely. Crude futures have continued their slide lower after OPEC confirmed that Saudi Arabia has restored the bulk of its lost oil supply. Coming up today, relatively quiet in the European morning. ECB's economic bulletin is due. From the US, we get a third look at their second quarter GDP print, their advanced good trade balance, weekly jobless claims and pending home sales. Of course, it's a busy day for central bank speakers, mostly in the European afternoon. They include ECB's Draghi, Bank of England's Cunliffe, and a whole host of Fed speakers, including Bullard, Clarida, and Daly. That's it from me. To hear live breaking news, type SQA on your Bloomberg terminal. Roger.
Okay, thanks very much indeed for that, Michael Reid. Now, here's Leanne Gerrans with more on what's going on around the world. Leanne.
Good morning, Roger. In Australia, abortion has been decriminalised across the country. This comes after New South Wales, the last remaining state where it was illegal, voted to reform its laws. The bill, which passed earlier this morning, overturns a 119-year-old law, which had been criticised by opponents as archaic. Hong Kong's ongoing protests look set to wipe out the usual amount of Chinese Golden Week tourists. The first week of October normally marks one of the busiest periods for the city's tourism and retail sectors, but Chinese tour groups are set to plunge as much as 86%. That's according to the Travel Industry Council. And finally, it's claimed people are buying and consuming less alcohol in Scotland as a result of a minimum price policy. Scotland was the first country to set a 50 pence per unit limit. Experts say the rest of the UK should quickly follow. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg Naira.
Leanne, thank you so much. Now, the White House has released details of the phone conversation that triggered the impeachment inquiry against the US president. In the call, Trump repeatedly implores Ukraine's president, whose country is heavily dependent on US aid, to help him smear former Vice President Joe Biden. Democrats say the release bolsters their case, but the president says it shows he did nothing wrong.
The witch hunt continues, but they're getting hit hard on this witch hunt because when they look at the information, it's a joke. Impeachment for that? When you have a wonderful meeting or you have a wonderful phone conversation?
Let's get more from Bloomberg reporter Kathleen Hunter. She covers US politics. Great to see you, Kathleen, again. So, for those who haven't actually read the rough transcript, who's more in the right here, the Democrats or President Trump?
Well, I think it comes down to whether or not you believe that there's anything wrong with the U.S. president asking for help from a foreign leader in investigating his political opponent. If you believe that that's wrong, then I think that you would consider the transcript to be damaging to Trump. Trump's case seems to be that there's nothing wrong in doing that. He's not saying that explicitly, but he's saying there was no quid pro quo, and so therefore there's not anything that warrants impeachment or warrants an investigation that amounts to a political witch hunt by his opponents. And so I think that's kind of where the battle line is going to come down, is not so much a question of did he do something illegal, which, we may find out he did. The Justice Department's position is that he didn't. But, the standard for whether or not the House could impeach him isn't necessarily whether he broke a law. And so I think that that's now going to be the question that Congress is going to have to answer.
Yeah, high crimes and misdemeanors is the official text, isn't it? Well, Kathleen, we're going to get a bit more, I guess, because the acting director of national intelligence is going to be testifying on Capitol Hill. What could we learn from that?
Well, I think it'll be significant and interesting to see. We know that now the whistleblower complaint, which was kind of the genesis of a lot of this latest sort of threat to Trump's presidency, we know that whistleblower complaint, it's been shrouded in mystery, has been transmitted to members of Congress, and they will have a chance to look at it before this hearing today. And so I think it'll be interesting to see what kinds of questions they ask ask and how they frame their questions based on what they've seen from the whistleblower complaint, and also whether or not any additional details come forth